He had ruled Egypt for nearly 30 years, was toppled and jailed after a popular uprising in 2011. Now a court says Hosni Mubarak is free to go. But what does this mean for the millions who revolted against him? And do they still want change? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem, Sika. 6 years after an uprising that toppled him, Egypt's former president Hosni Mubarak will now walk free. On Monday, a prosecutor ordered his release from a military hospital prison. Now, this was just days after an appeals court acquitted him of ordering the killing of protesters during the 2011 uprising. Mubarak served as Egypt's president for nearly 3 decades, but many viewed him as an autocratic leader who crushed dissent and embezzled millions of dollars for himself and his family. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Mohammed Jamjoom.
First came news that Egypt's highest judicial authority had confirmed the acquittal of former President Hosni Mubarak. Now, according to the state news agency, the country's prosecutor has ordered Mubarak's release. 88-year-old Mubarak, who ruled for 3 decades before being overthrown in 2011, was accused of inciting the deaths of nearly 900 protesters during Egypt's uprising. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2012, but those charges were dismissed just 2 years later after an Egyptian appeals court ordered a retrial. Separately, Mubarak and his 2 sons, Ala and Gamal, were also sentenced to 3 years in jail on corruption charges. That sentence took into account the time that had already been served, and Mubarak's sons are already free. Al Jazeera's Middle East analyst says this latest turn is hardly surprising.
The seeds of his acquittal were planted carefully in the indictment itself. I mean, picking up the charges, those specific charges, were actually giving Hosni Mubarak the innocence sentence eventually. I mean, the first trial was a politicized verdict.
Egypt's 18-day-long revolt led not just to the downfall of Mubarak, but also the democratic election of MOHAMED MORSI, who served as president for 1 year before being deposed by the military. Taking his place, Mubarak's former head of military intelligence, FATTAH SISI, who led a major crackdown targeting supporters of the banned Muslim Brotherhood and pro-democracy activists. While some say Egypt is again at a crossroads, others say the country has come full circle. Just over 6 years since the revolution, many members of the Mubarak regime are free, while more and more activists and critics find themselves in jail. Mohammed Jamjoom, Al Jazeera.
Well, that was then, but now rights demanded by protesters in Tahrir Square have been all but shut down. Since he became president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has presided over a crackdown on opposition and dissent. In August 2013, more than 700 supporters of deposed President Mohamed MORSI were shot dead by police during a rally. Many blame Sisi for giving the order. Tens of thousands have been jailed and hundreds of Muslim Brotherhood supporters sentenced to death in mass trials. Hundreds of activists are in jail for violating an anti-protest law passed by Sisi in 2013. In contrast, Mubarak-era officials have been cleared of charges. But with the presidential election looming next year, President Sisi now has to deal with a weak economy that would bring back anger to the streets. Tourism is in decline, there are food shortages, and prices are soaring. Nearly a quarter of the country's roughly 94 million people live in poverty. The official unemployment rate is 13%, and it's triple that among young Egyptians. Well, let's bring in our guests now. Joining us here in Doha, we have Shehata, Associate Professor of Politics at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. In Cairo, we have Timothy Kaldas, non-resident fellow at Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. And joining us from Washington, D.C., Mohammed Sultan, former political prisoner in Egypt. Mohammed is an American-Egyptian human rights advocate. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. So, Samir, if I could start with you. How do you view this news? It's not a huge surprise for people on both sides of this debate, but is this kind of Do we see this as a final reminder that Egypt has returned to its pre-revolutionary order with this ruling?
I don't think Egypt has returned to a pre-revolutionary order. I mean, there's been a lot of change, but the change hasn't necessarily been for the better. So it is certainly a reminder that the goals and aspirations of 2011, of January 25, of the revolution, have not been fulfilled. I mean, as you've said, Mubarak really hasn't seen justice, and the Mubarak regime hasn't seen justice, and certainly the people have not achieved bread, freedom, and social justice, which were the demands, of course, in 2011.
Timothy Kaldas, is that how you view it?
I think that I would agree with Samer's assessment that things are not exactly the same, but certainly the same fundamental clique of the 1952 coup and revolution continues to rule Egypt in some form or another today, and the military continues to be the backbone of the current government. At the same time, obviously, the changes that came as a result of increased awareness amongst the citizenry and people engaging in politics and looking at it as something that they could participate in a fundamentally different way has altered the regime's level of comfort vis-a-vis the population.
Mohammed Sultan, as someone who was locked up in an Egyptian jail yourself, you obviously have a very personal experience of this. I wonder if you could talk about that and tell us how that has shaped the way you see things right now.
Well, I mean, thank you for having me, first of all. I would definitely agree with what was just said. I would take it a step further and say that the crackdown, the current crackdown, is unprecedented. You know, when I first went in, when I was first arrested in Egypt, we were asking the question inside of prison with a lot of folks, people that were picked up not just necessarily for opposing the military coup, but folks that were just picked up that were at the wrong place at the wrong time. We were asking the question, why is this regime arresting so many people? The month I was arrested, my uncle was one of the 9 that was executed in extrajudicial killing in the 6th of October. And with so many cases of enforced disappearances, we're now saying, we're saying, hey, listen, just arrest people. Just don't make them disappear like, you know, the hundreds of cases that are reported by, you know, local and international human rights organizations. We're just saying, just arrest them. Just put them in prison. Let us know where they are. So the escalation, the unprecedented escalation in crackdown and the conditions, the repression conditions inside of prison and outside, and the closing down of any political space, the close down of you know, the NGO and the civil society space, I think it's unprecedented. So it's not a full circle. It's a very meditated effort to that barrier of fear that, you know, that the folks, us in January 2011, that barrier of fear that the young revolutionary youth that once hoped for a better Egypt, a changed Egypt, you know, trying to reinstill that barrier of fear, trying to instill that ceiling of hopes and dreams that, you know, you can only hope and dream so long as you are somebody's son, so long as you know somebody. Just and on that ceiling is where these generals and these elitists build their, you know, their empires with no accountability. So the current conditions in Egypt are not only is there's an attempt to roll back the 2011 revolution, but it's an unprecedented crackdown to reinstill the barrier of fear and reinstill and rebuild that ceiling on the Egyptian people's and the Egyptian youth's hopes and dreams.
Samer Shehata, and given what Mohammed has just been describing there, is that why we haven't seen many protests in the last couple of years in Egypt, or is it just that there just isn't the desire there or to go out into the streets?
Right. I think it's more the former and not the latter. In other words, and actually there have been protests. And in fact, immediately after 2013, after the killing of the protesters in several squares in Cairo and Rabat and so on, and in the year after that, there were protests. They weren't well covered, of course, locally, but there were protests. But the level of repression, there's no question that the level of repression has been significantly greater, both in terms of making protests illegal, the protest law, the anti-protest law, but as well as what was said previously, that is, the people who are being imprisoned, of course, are not just now the members of the Muslim Brotherhood or sympathizers, but many of the youth activists and so on who took down Mubarak and also took down Morsi. So the number of people who are in jail are significantly greater. At the same time, because of the repression, I think we've seen a new kind of response or a new phenomenon, which is increased violence and terrorism. There's no question that that is, to a large extent, a result of the coup in 2013 and a policy of dealing with terrorism that only uses brute force and doesn't address the fundamental issues. We've seen that in Sinai, of course, parts of which we see terrorism regularly against the security forces, also against Christians and others. And we've seen some terrorism, of course, in the mainland as well.
Timothy Kaldas, how would you characterize the political climate in Egypt right now? And how would you compare it to the Mubarak era, to pre-2011?
I think if we're comparing it to the waning years of Mubarak's rule, then absolutely the climate is far more repressive, and there's far less space for any sort of independent press or critical discourse to take place. Moreover, the violence from the state increased substantially following the coup in 2013. I want to add that while undoubtedly the repression has contributed greatly to the drop in the number of protests that we're witnessing, there is another thing to consider. From the perspective of much of the population, they've overthrown two governments, and their situation in terms of their economic well-being, their ability to find gainful employment, has gotten materially worse. And that's not to say that the uprisings are the reason for that, but from the perspective of many of the people who participated in these uprisings and the populations that they live with, they don't see these uprisings as having contributed to improvements in their lives. And so there's reason for them not to trust that another one would contribute to any sort of benefit for them.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that, Timothy, the economic situation, which we described a little bit at the top there. How much of a factor is that going to be, do you think, going forward with the elections coming up next year?
Well, I mean, right now the government is in a pretty difficult situation in terms of trying to emerge from this economic crisis while simultaneously holding back some of the pressures on the poor. I mean, we have record levels of inflation right now that are really devastating to a lot of people, and just rumors that the bread subsidy was going to be cut resulted in sporadic protests in a number of provinces. The fact of the matter is that, at least for the time being, food subsidies aren't actually on the chopping block because the government isn't interested in pressuring that population any further. And also, even the IMF called for increasing funding for food subsidies. But the government is definitely keeping an eye out for trying to find any sort of valve to relieve some of that economic pressure, because it's very clear that following the float of the pound in November and the inflation that came with it, people have really been struggling. And we're seeing numbers in which inflation is breaking well past 30%. And food inflation on fruits and vegetables was actually over 35% before the float. So just basic staples have gotten prohibitively expensive for many people.
Mohammed Sultan, what's your view on that?
I mean, I want to comment on what Professor Samer said. I mean, I definitely agree. I want to hit back on the security issue really quickly. And again, from my own experience in some of the, what I've witnessed inside of these prisons. And, it's important to note that these prisons in Egypt that have increasing numbers, record-breaking numbers of political prisoners, the ideological shifts that are happening in those same prisons that in the 50s and 60s, gave birth to violent movements that then, grandfathered ISIS today. And it's very, very important to note that these ideological shifts are happening all across. For sure, this again unprecedented police brutality and repression and crackdown, and an influx of news inside of prison. I remember even just as an Egyptian American who thought that hey, if we were not being treated properly in Egypt, that the U.S. government would somehow, intervene or, have some sort of oversight to ensure that at least, people are treated with decency. And when we got just an influx of information where we heard Secretary of State, at the same month where you had these violent mass dispersals of protesters, you had the Secretary of State of the United States of America saying that Egypt on its road to democracy. You've had, so this influx of information that, these ISIS recruiters inside of prison, they walked around with this air of a victorious air. When you heard, again, things happening in Sinai, bombings, whatever, killings of soldiers, of whatever you heard, when you hear even just in the heart of Cairo, that we forget the Italian consulate was blown up in the heart of Cairo. When you hear all of these things and they walk around with this air because they're getting an influx of positive, what they perceive as positive news, and the pro-democracy all across, whether you're talking about the political Islamists or you're talking about just the pro-democracy January 25th revolutionaries, and when you're getting an influx of the international community slowly but surely abandoning its own values and its own principles, which it stands on, and adopting this military regime that's cracking down on its own people, it's all of these things play into the slow and sure ideological shifts that are happening in prison that we're probably going to have to deal with in 5-10 years.
Samer Shehata, I know you want to respond to some of that.
No, I think even the academic literature really testifies to what Mohammed just says. I mean, the academic literature says that repression leads, and particularly in prison, leads to this kind of result. I mean, first of all, anyone comes to the conclusion that peaceful political participation doesn't pay off, right? I mean, if you were an Islamist and so on, and you believed in elections and democracy and so on, 2011, 2013 shows you that, peaceful political participation does not pay off. That's the first thing. Secondly, it leads to people who are the victims of violence wanting retribution and so on, and that leads to direct violence as well. And then it leads to a discourse that says, violence against the state is justified because that's the only language that the state understands. So I think the academic literature, whether it's on what happened in Algeria in the 1990s or elsewhere, really testifies to this. But the other thing that's changed, of course, and this gets to the question that you asked Tim a moment ago, is that the region has changed dramatically as well. And so not only is the economic situation just quite bad and getting worse than it was in 2011. But people look at the region, and the regime uses this also and says, look what's going on in Syria, look what's going on in Libya, look what's going on in Yemen. And no one wants...
Egypt is stable.
Egypt is better than Syria, and look, we don't want to go down that road and so on. That's used by the regime as a discourse, but it also leads people to want stability and stasis. So that is part of the reason why you don't see as much political activism today as you did much earlier.
Timothy Kaldas, just going back to the events of January and February 2011, those 18 days that led to Mubarak's removal. How does the regime view that period? Because it is a fact that the military were the ones who removed Hosni Mubarak. So is that something that's not something that they can just kind of sweep under the rug? Is that something that they have to acknowledge?
I mean, the official discourse still acknowledges January 25th as a revolution. Sisi has referred to it as such. The government doesn't really speak of Mubarak that much, to be honest with you. And certainly, they're not going to make any statements endorsing him when he does leave prison. Mubarak, on the other hand, has endorsed Sisi as president back in 2014 when he took office. But I think that the government would rather the Mubarak story stay quiet and not really engage with it. And frankly, I don't think they're going to be under a lot of pressure to do so, because one of the results of the situation in Egypt becoming so difficult for people is that, unfortunately, we're reaching a point where many people have grown somewhat nostalgic for the days in which Mubarak was president. The economy was a little bit less worse off. It was a little bit easier to find a job that could cover your expenses. The price of goods was lower. These basic tourism was functional. I mean, these things, they affect people's daily lives. And when they look at what they've given up in exchange for these uprisings and for these political movements, I think a lot of people look at that calculus with some degree of regret. Now, my personal assessment is that a lot of the challenges that Egypt is dealing with now have more to do with the the centers of power of the government during the Mubarak period refusing to give up power and using force and using all sorts of repression to maintain power. And that has caused a great deal of hardship for a lot of people. The violence of the state has scared away investors, has scared away tourists, has scared away a lot of people, and has undermined the ability of Egypt to reform and grow. So it's not really the revolution that I would blame for that. It's more the counter-revolutionary efforts of those in power.
Mohammed Sultan, if there are rays of hope that you're looking for in all of this, what would they be as far as the future in Egypt?
A month after I came out, I received some handmade gifts from some of the female prisoners in Egypt congratulating me on my release. And one of them at the time was Sanat Saif, and she's a prominent activist in Egypt, and the sister of Ala FATTAH, who's again one of the most prominent, iconic Egyptian activists. And she sent me a little bracelet, a handmade bracelet, and next to it there was a quote from one of the revolutionary songs, and it just had one word, and I ended up giving this gift. I ended up giving the bracelet as a gift to Samantha Power. Ambassador Samantha Power, and I let her know
it's
what the
former
gift,
U.S.
the
UN ambassador.
And it said, if we, UN ambassador to the UN, and it said, if we stop dreaming, we'll die. And this was the attitude I felt like we, people that have come out of prison and went back in, like Sanat Saif and others. People who refuse to give up on that dream, where, again, that ceiling of dreams and hopes that we ended up breaking through in the January 25th in Tahrir Square, and we inspired the entire world. I think a lot of young people who've got their whole lives ahead of them and have dedicated their lives to the well-being of Egypt, of seeing a better, a changed Egypt, have not given up. And although this might be a negative milestone in the Egyptian revolutions, but it's definitely not the end. And again, you've seen examples of people coming out of prison full force and ready to stay active on issues regarding Egypt. So the dream is not dead.
You share that sentiment, or does it remain a distant dream for people in Egypt?
Well, I think it's a dream. I don't know how distant it is. But I mean, I agree. I think that if anything, 2011 showed, first of all the problems of 2011 are still there, right, as we've heard, in terms of income inequality, corruption, youth unemployment, dysfunctional political system, and so on. Those aren't going away, and that led to 2011. I think the other thing that we learned, both academics as well as people, is these regimes are not as permanent and stable and invincible as we perceived, and so on. And so you don't know what will set off a mass wave of protest and so on. And I think, in fact, the extent of repression and the extent of crackdown shows how brittle and fearful and paranoid the regime actually is.
So, Timothy Kaldas, final word to you then. In terms of how you see this playing out, do you see the glass half full or half empty?
I'm afraid I'm rather pessimistic, at least in terms of the political area. I don't see much progress on that front happening anytime in the foreseeable future. I think that the regime has been quite successful at, for those who aren't in exile or in prison or dead, many people have decided to stay quiet for the time being to stay safe. And the ability to organize politically in Egypt is quite limited at this moment, and I don't think that's going to change anytime too soon. I mean, the repression that we've seen, certainly contributes in certain fields to radicalization, but also it helps the regime rebuild the specter of fear that authoritarianism rests upon, and they've been very meticulous in rebuilding that wall of fear.
All right, that's where we'll have to leave it. Thanks very much, Timothy Kaldas, Mohammed Sultan, and Samer Shehata. Thanks very much. all of you for being on Inside Story. And thank you, as always, for watching. Remember, you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.